everyone. Welcome to a new episode of Real Talk, Real Stories. My name is Advita Patel, and I am one of the co-founders of the Asian Comms Network. And for those of you who don't know what the Asian Comms Network is, we are a membership organization helping Asian professionals from South and East Asian backgrounds in marketing, public relations, communications, and any creative backgrounds to be part of a safe, collaborative community. These sessions that we're doing every week, we have a guest and we talk about their background, their story, so you get to know a little bit more about our community and also the people behind our community. If you want to find out more about the Asian Comms Network, then you're more than welcome to visit our website, asiancommsnetwork.com. Today's guest is someone I know lots of people have been very excited about hearing from, and Mehreen is one of our advisory board members as well as being the economics editor at the Times. Welcome, Mehreen. How are you?
I'm really well. Thanks so much for having me, Advita. Thanks for everyone who's logged on as well.
Yeah, thank you. And if you're watching us live, then please do share in the comments where you're tuning in from, who you are, share a little bit about yourself as well, because this is about you connecting with others, whether you're an ally, an advocate, a community member, or someone who's just interested in the work that we do. So please do share whether you're watching live or even if you're watching on replay. And if you have questions for Mehreen as we go through this conversation today, then please do pop them down in the comments as well. So Mehreen, I've introduced you by your job title, but do you want to tell our watchers who you are, your background, a little bit more about yourself?
Yeah, so I currently work as the economics editor at the Times, which is a job that I've had for about just over 3 years now. I've probably been in journalism for nearly a decade, which actually makes me sound quite old, but it has been nearly 10 years. And I've basically been in newspaper journalism that whole time. I used to work at the FT as a Brussels correspondent based out in Belgium, covering the European Union. I've covered financial markets. And I guess I started off in journalism. I mean, it's been quite a circuitous route to get to where I am because I actually started off as a sports journalist. So finding my way into economics wasn't obvious, but it happened because I think the news of the world at the time, so around 2015, 2016, was very much still about things around the economy, and that's sort of where I've ended up by accident. So I have never studied economics formally. I read books about economics, and I've always read financial news, and I've studied a bit of economic history, but I'm not a trained economist, so it probably wasn't my plan. But it's been a fantastic job, and I feel incredibly privileged to basically write about some of the most important policy stories in the world over the last 10 years or so.
Wow, what a journey. And it's so interesting to find out that you haven't had the kind of economics background, but you've obviously taught and learned and adjusted and adapted based on the role that you are doing today. And I find that interesting because a lot of folks where I speak with and spend time with believe that they need to have an incredible amount of knowledge in one area before they can make space for that work or that job. What kind of encouraged you, I suppose, to apply for this opportunity? What was that kind of pull for you to go into the economic side of the journalism that you're doing?
Yeah, I guess I probably was a bit like some of those people because I wanted to be a sports journalist because I was basically a fanatical sports fan, in particular a football fan. I mean, I've never been a footballer, so I was not a practitioner, but I would say that I had a lot of enthusiasm, and the word that people use a lot is passion. And so it was natural for me to want to write about the things that I love. I actually realized I didn't really love writing about the things that I loved because it was something that I was now considering my massive interest to be part of my work life. And it actually sort of dimmed my enthusiasm for being for football anyway. And I guess with journalism, especially financial journalism, a lot of people that you will meet who will study finance or economics probably want to go into things like financial services and very lucrative careers, particularly in the City of London, because we're based in the UK. That's like a big, huge sort of sucks up a lot of talent, that people who want to study finance or business. So journalism is not really obvious. And also, if you study economics, there's obviously very academic paths that you can go down. But I think with financial journalism, and most of my career has been with other financial journalists, we've all sort of just ended up here by accident. That's because people started working at a trade mag. Their first job was an intern somewhere in a specialist financial magazine, whether it's writing about housing policy or the bond market or currencies. And then there's a sort of path dependency that once you get your foot into the door because you want to be a reporter and you end up in financial journalism, you sort of end up a little bit in financial journalism. I think economics is a little bit different because there's always been a policy, very firmly focused policy angle towards economics. There is a market side. There is a lot of politics involved in economics. So in some ways, I think it marries some of the sexier parts of journalism. You know, people want to go and work in Westminster. They want to cover government. They want to do diplomacy. They want to do international news. You can do that in economics journalism, or you could just be a really, really nerdy economics journalist who just wants to write about central banks. So within my world, there are various ways in which you can do this job. And I would say for me, the political economy stuff, so the stuff I just spoke about, so trying to understand policy and political implications of economics is what I really enjoy. And in some senses, that was normal for me because I studied history and politics, and I sort of grew up in the world where Lehman Brothers had crashed and the whole world was basically on fire for a few years of the financial crisis. So for me, this was obviously the most important story in the world growing up. So it didn't, to going into economics journalism for me didn't feel like I was sort of falling into a rabbit hole of non-relevance. It actually felt like the most important thing in the world back then. And to be honest, probably with the likes of Donald Trump, it still feels very much like that as well.
So taking you back to your kind of childhood, and just before we went live, I was telling you some of the experiences a lot of South and East Asian people feel when they're growing up in terms of the traditional types of careers that we're often encouraged to pursue. As you were kind of growing up and recognizing, understanding the direction you may have wanted to go in terms of your career, did you have like an instant pull to journalism? Did you know from a very young age this is what you wanted to do, or was it something that you just kind of ended up experiencing and falling into? Like, how did that journey start for you?
Yeah, I mean, I would definitely be lying if I told you that it was my life career to be a journalist. But now I look back, I think it was probably very natural for me that I have ended up in this job, mainly because I consumed a lot of news when I was younger. So I was very sort of politically aware when I was a kid. We had 24-hour news on in my household. And so I was just exposed to the world from TV, and I started reading newspapers, like the actual paper stuff, when I was still in high school. And the 2000s, the era in which I grew up, was very politically tumultuous if you were a South Asian or a Muslim living in the UK or in Europe, because there were a lot of things going on in the world that directly impacted the way you felt about yourself or how you were treated by the rest of society. So in some senses, I always had a strong political awareness, but I was never probably going to go into politics. It's often something that people would have, and still to this day, say, it's just, you should go into politics. Like, I mean, mostly politicians say that because for them, it's obvious that the only reason you could care about the world is because you want to go into politics. But I think that was never a route I was going to go down. And being a massive consumer of news, I couldn't say that I wanted to be a journalist because I didn't know any journalists.
Yeah.
I've never met a journalist. Nobody in my family, nobody in our family friends. What is it, journalism? I didn't know the first thing about the media. I didn't know how the first thing to get an internship. This was a completely closed off world that I only had experience of as a consumer. So in some senses, it was very, very, very far away. And even at university, most of my friends were doing spring weeks or internships in the financial sector or for the civil service. Nobody was going into the media. So it just wasn't real. It wasn't a reality. Until I started doing what a lot of people did in the 2010s, which is I started self-publishing. I opened a blog. I just wrote stuff and I just published it online. And that was my first entry into thinking about writing and doing journalism, and not even traditional student journalism, just stuff that I was just doing off my own back. And then after that, the path dependency happened, and I had a portfolio which I could show people, and I was working for free a lot, which happens a lot in this industry. And that's how it happened. But it would have been completely foreign to a younger me to say that you're going to become a journalist, because when you just don't know anything about this career or profession beyond watching people on TV talking about the news, you just would never imagine yourself to be in their shoes.
Yeah, I mean, that's a tough one, isn't it? Like you just said, when you don't have, when I always ask people the questions like, who inspired you when you were growing up? How did you get involved in the world of communications, PR, and journalism? It's often the answers are we didn't have anyone that we could look up to that looked like us, that showed us that we belonged in this space. So it's almost through sheer determination and grit that you made it work. To your point, you realized, actually, how do I showcase my work? How do I demonstrate my ability? What do I have control over that I can work on? So, you know, in the early 2010s and those points, it was blogging, right? To your point, is how do I show my talents? How do I show that I care about these specific areas? Because you do need to kind of, sometimes when you wait for validation and permission from other people, it doesn't often arrive. And it's harder when you are an underrepresented person as well, because people don't often see you in that role. You know, it's very unusual to see someone who's different from the white majority in a role, especially in like UK and mainland Europe and US and those kind of places. When you shared with your family that you were pursuing this career in journalism and you wanted to kind of work in this space, what was their reaction? Because you said that obviously you had nobody in your family that was in this world. So how did they react when you first shared this with them?
I mean, it was a complete non-reaction. So if I'm just sort of thinking back about, telling my parents whether I wanted to do a master's or whether I should go into journalism, I mean, they were a bit more like, maybe you should do your master's first and go into journalism, which is what I ended up doing. But I'll be very honest, and I don't think that they had any sort of hostile reaction to it. Potentially, possibly because I went in to study the arts. I did a degree in the humanities. I studied history, and my master's was also around sort of political science. So there wasn't a sense in which I was already telling, I did 5 years of medicine. And I said, guys, I'm going to be a journalist. I think that would have hurt them, but it wasn't like that, because by the age of 18, I sort of made some choices which would have suggested that I was going to end up in a career path that wasn't going to be traditional engineering, law, a lot of these white collar professions. I think there's always a sense in which my family probably, don't really understand what I do, but that's probably a more reflection of how journalism has changed. I mean, most of the time, I think, when I'm on TV, that's sort of where my family think this is the apex of journalism, is because I'm on telly, which I think is normal, because of the exposure and people can see you, and there's a direct relevance to it. But I think newspaper journalism, they understood that I loved it, and that I was fully determined to do this. And whether it was sports or economics or financial journalism, I never got anything but a huge amount of encouragement. I also, when I was in my 20s, went abroad. I was a foreign correspondent, which I think something that my family would never have considered, that I would go off to another country to write about it or write about other things. But when these opportunities came, I was very lucky that I always had a huge amount of support, because my family could see how much it meant to me. And they could also see how difficult an industry it was, because I always kept telling them, guys, this is what I want to do, but I'm probably never going to be able to make a career out of this, because it's so hard. Because it's so hard to get in, it's so hard to stay in, it's not particularly lucrative financially. And if I can get one foot in the door, I'm already probably doing better than a lot of people. So once I was sort of, hired by very, august media establishments, I think they were just nothing but exceptionally proud that I'd managed to make it. And that they could say that they also knew someone in journalism, because it was just a bit weird.
Yeah, I mean, that's it. It's that curiosity that it evokes in them as well, right? It's like, this is amazing. And we spoke just before about the people that we may have looked up to, that we related with, and there wasn't really, when I was growing up, in the mid 90s, there 100% was no one that I could even name today that I saw as a South Asian journalist in terms of my lived experience at all. And even in today, even though things have changed, it hasn't changed massively. And as you said, the world of journalism has changed as well, in terms of how we consume news, who becomes like the people who write news, who can now be part of that world. So when you started off blogging in 2010, it was a fairly different thing that people did. But nowadays, everybody is a bit of a storyteller, especially with AI, right? Those two letters that either give the fear or excite people. What are your thoughts in where AI is taking journalism? What are your kind of, I suppose, hopes and fears about this new tool and technology we've got?
Yeah, I mean, it's part of another barrage of sort of technological change, which this industry has been dealing with and grappling with for probably 15 to 20 years. The biggest one, for probably when I was growing up, is the transition from traditional print media to the internet, right? And I still remember when I was trying to break into journalism, I'd still hear very, very senior editors of newspapers saying the internet was just a phase and it was a fad and it will go away and we'll keep printing money through printing dead tree versions of newspapers, because that's just how people consume news. And it was clear that it was never going to go away. So the 2010s was sort of the era of BuzzFeed. It was the era of kind of startup internet sites, Vox Media, also in financial journalism. You had a lot of sort of new entries who were trying to get attention and clicks. It was very sort of click-based, how to get people to click on your stories, how to make them as engaging as possible in the often dry and, sometimes stale world of financial media. So I've always, the internet was not a phase. There has been some, I think, establishments that have coped much better with the transition than others, but it has basically led to a lot of sort of commercial anxiety because these newspapers are expensive to fund, and they have lost just a huge lucrative source of funding, which has been commercial print advertising, which is disappearing at pace. So you move to subscription models, paywalls, which the Times has and the FT has, for example. And so now AI on top of that, along with, I think, the coterminous phenomena being also the rise of social media and platforms. And as you said, basically people just being able to publish and tell their own stories themselves in a very unmediated and direct way, which is what people do now. These are all kind of coming at us in all different directions. There has been, I think there's one obvious response from traditional media to AI, which is to partner up with them. And that has happened. So I think initially, the New York Times was the first to actually sue OpenAI because of the use of the New York Times' archive for LLMs that were going to be used by generative AI. Since that kind of initial hostility, now you see traditional media like the News UK group, which is what I'm part of, doing deals with huge AI companies to say you will be allowed access to our, hundreds of years of archived material to help with your LLMs and to help sort of refine your chat GPTs of this world. So there is a sense in which there is some collaboration, but where does that really end if we are providing basically, hundreds, as I said, massive resources to these models to help refine them for some commercial benefit? Ultimately, are we just sort of cannibalizing ourselves because we're offering a fantastic resource to this incredible new technology? I think the collaboration is probably sensible, because when I described the rise of the internet, it was very hostile, right? So Google was a threat, Facebook was a threat, all these platforms were a threat to traditional media. You weren't allowed to post links in certain places, or you'd be hit with paywalls, etc. And it was all very tense. And I think the traditional media has learned a little bit over the last few years to embrace rather than to fight back, but without really any sense of teleology, because we don't really know where this is going to land. We're perhaps just sort of breathing and hoping that it just buys us a few more years to some degree. Sometimes I do feel like that. So I couldn't tell you what's going to happen. I think AI as a journalistic resource is interesting. I mean, we are encouraged at the Times to use certain forms of generative AI to help with our reporting. But ultimately, what we try and do, and what reporting is some degree of originality to uncover stuff that people don't know. And that just requires quite traditional skills, like talking to people, finding people, reading documents, doing investigations, getting out of the office. And that skill of journalism, I don't know whether that is going to survive in the new era, because so many younger people who are going into the media don't really see themselves as traditional journalists. They see themselves as more, you said, storytellers. And that I think there's a different burden of veracity on facts. There's even a different attitude towards what facts are, that I think is now becoming pervasive among people, probably, I would say probably under the age of 35. They also just don't consume the sort of media that I work in as well. So it's very much, I feel there is a degree in which the world is sort of bifurcating generationally when it comes to journalism and what journalism is. I mean, the optimistic part of me would say there's always going to be a place for journalism, because we need it. We need it in democracies. We need it for healthy democracies. But the health of our democracies is declining at a pace, I would say. So in some senses, the decline of journalism is just symptomatic of so much societal change that's happening, which is a very gloomy answer to your question. But I probably, in the long sense, I am probably quite pessimistic about sustaining the kinds of works that I've been involved in my career.
Yeah, I mean, this is the thing, isn't it? It's a realism of what we have to face, and I believe what you've shared, and I try to be optimistic to an extent when it comes to this kind of things. But you're right, I've seen the world of journalism decline over the last decade and more, to be honest with you. And to your point, people are reframing how they share stories and how they present themselves as journalists going forward and stuff. And I do think that with the new generation coming in, things will adapt and adjust again. But on the kind of optimistically hopeful side, to your point, I do believe there's a place for people to find new areas of work. The connection, as great as AI is, it will still never be able to do the human connection bit, right? It'll never give us that. As much as you can train it and all that, it'll never give us that real human connection, that trust building that you often get, where you get some of those incredible insights to write that powerful piece for the paper or whatever you're supporting. If in terms of what you've shared, and I know it seems a bit doom and gloom to an extent, but if a young journalist or someone who's aspiring to be a journalist is listening to this conversation, what one big piece of advice would you give them? Like, what's the one key takeaway that you've learned in your career and would advocate for to give them that kind of optimistic hope?
Yeah, I mean, I think in the really long sense, I'm probably a little pessimistic, but I think in the short to medium sense, I'm very optimistic, because I described, when I described even 10 years ago, entering a relatively closed, exclusionary world where there's limited job opportunities. Now, in the last 10 years, I would say the range of voices, your ability to access other people's types of stories, and the inclusion of media has just been blown apart. So traditional news had always had a sort of monopoly on setting the agenda, on deciding what the news was, on deciding how they were going to influence politics or corporations. All of that has now gone. I think that monopoly has been completely burst open, which has created fantastic opportunities for people to have powerful voices from marginalized communities, completely underrepresented communities, and those who would never be able to break into a newsroom in the 2010s or the 90s or the 80s, right? So that is why I think entering the media now, let's call it the media rather than journalism, is just it's in some senses, it's almost become a second sense to people, because they're already posting or sharing things about their lives. So their voices, they speak in their native voice, they write in a native voice, they understand audiences, they kind of get algorithms, they're so much in tune with how to promote or put content out into the world that engages people, that is actually quite frightening to a lot of people like my editors or the sort of people that I work with in newsrooms, for whom this is very scary, because this is a challenge and it's a rival and it's an alternative. So I'm super optimistic about what's already sort of been happening, even if I'm a little bit worried about the longer term sort of consequences for what it means for us. So my advice in that sense is for people to embrace this democratization of media, and the blowing open of old monopolies, and the systemic undermining of so much mainstream news. Because if this is a marketplace, then we have to fight for people's ears and eyes and people's attentions. And if we're losing, that's probably because we're doing something wrong. And so I think if there's no longer sort of fetishization of traditional media, there is a prestige element that it used to have that I think has also been undermined. And I think that's pretty healthy generally. I think people apply way more scrutiny to what they read and to what they hear than they used to do, because they have alternative sources of news. And huge stories like what's happened in Palestine and in Gaza for the last 2 years have really shown up the failings of my industry, and will be pivotal moments in people's political upbringings and their shapings of their identity. And, in some senses, when the toothpaste's out the tube, it's not going to go back. Yeah. So we are living in this very scary but ultimately quite exhilarating world of news media. And if you are a younger person or someone who thinks this is not for you, actually, it's probably way more for you than it is anyone, let's be honest, over the age of 40 who doesn't really understand so much of the change that's happening. So I think there's a sort of inbuilt advantage that people have, new entrants, people who don't feel this is for them, because the world is changing and it is just for them as much as it is for anyone else. And in some ways, platforms, TikTok, Instagram, YouTube are completely validating, because you just see the numbers, right? It's very easy to understand the feedback in these platforms because you see the numbers and the engagement. Newspaper journalism is so weird, because I write so many stories a day. They just sort of go out into the world, and then I don't know who's read. I mean, I don't really just know that much about it. Yeah. So we have way more data, way more information at our disposal to understand what works and what doesn't work. And these are all fantastic tools that I just didn't have when I started off my career. So in some senses, I think so many people who want to get into this industry have massive, massive advantages because of the changing nature of the world. So I am very optimistic that that they won't meet some of the barriers that I've done, and people who've gone into this industry before me and other generations have too.
Yeah, you're spot on in terms of the access people have now than they didn't have when you started your career, and definitely when I started my career, in terms of tools, technology, insight, data, testing things. You kind of like you said, when I started my career, right, blogging did not exist. So and LinkedIn wasn't where it was today. There was no social media. So the only way you could really be seen and heard was getting out and about and doing the networking. And depending on your circumstances, and your privileges that you may have had, you may or may not been able to do that. And I didn't grow up in central London. I grew up out in Manchester. A very different vibe in that place in terms of access and interest and getting involved in careers. When you started, the blogging world was picking up, right? So you could be seen in outside of your own kind of community because you were putting yourself out there. Now, in the 2020s, we're seeing the explosion of TikTok and Instagram, and Snapchat is still around, and YouTube. So you can create your own platform to be seen and heard. So, and to your point, acknowledge what's working and what isn't working, and building trust quite quickly, which takes us to a different set of problems, which is around that misinformation and disinformation, right? Because that's the other challenge that we do have when people do take control of their own platform. They need to do their own diligence in what they're sharing and how accurate it is. And if you are, to your point earlier, if you're leaning 100% on AI to give you that insight, you are already peppered with bias and misinformation without that. So that's the other bit of advice I would give to folks who are starting out is, yes, these tools are incredible and these tools will give you the insight and give you the platform and give you the support. But we have a ethical role and a moral role to make sure that we are not pushing the misinformation, disinformation that's available to us right now, which is why we're dealing and managing these horrible situations that are so peppered in bias and fake news, let's be honest, for clickbait, right? Ultimately, what you said before. So I would just say, just be mindful of that. And I don't think you should ever let go of your curiosity and asking those kind of questions. To your point, you created that platform. People found you. You had a whole load of portfolio then to showcase at your interviews and jobs that you went for, and you pushed through that. When you think about, your entire career, Mehreen, to date, what has been your kind of boldest or proudest achievement? Like, what are you so thinking back over your last 10 plus years, what's been that pinnacle moment in your career where you're like, I'm so proud and I'm so proud I've achieved this?
It's a very good question. Probably not one I've ever asked myself, actually. I think a lot of people just look back on the stories that they wrote and thought that was brilliant, and I'm glad that I got that over the line. For me, it probably is something like that. I wrote a piece when I was at the FT, and it really, really annoyed a very, very important person, like really annoyed them. And I think, to be honest, so probably 50% of my journalistic identity is trolling people, and not for the sake of it, but really, trying to push their buttons. There is a lot of that instinct that you have, and I don't know whether people still have that instinct to hold power to account. It sounds very sort of highfalutin and very noble, but you do end up doing it a lot in journalism, whether it's your intention or not. Sometimes you will write something that will really just hit someone's buttons, and probably because it's really true, and they don't like hearing it. And I think that gives me a great degree of satisfaction. I mean, it's probably a little bit unhealthy to be too attached to the idea that you want to annoy people all the time, because that, you don't want to become a troll, right? You don't want to be somebody who's just a keyboard warrior who's spending all your time on Twitter sending tweets to people saying, calling them out for stuff. But when you can do it in a journalistic way that is reasonable and it's been thought out and is kind of a view or a piece of uncovering something that people don't know about, it's incredibly powerful, and it's totally exhilarating, and it is the best part of this job. And that's the sort of thing that makes me think that, I may have sounded like I've trashed traditional media a lot in this conversation, but what you said about the disinformation world is important, because ultimately I have a network of editors and sub-editors and commissioners and lawyers that if I am in a situation where something goes out into the world and it's challenged by someone, I have a support network. I have the ability to rely on my employer to back me up in said situation, or to go and write the letter back to the law firm that is saying that this is defamation or whatever. So there is a structure in place to deal with attacks. And I think this really scary thing about so much of social media is that you can be a content creator that puts stuff out into the world, but you're just so exposed to how people feel about you, and you can get trashed and you can lose trust very quickly, just as quickly as you could gain it. And you're sort of alone. And it's probably quite dizzying. And there isn't that support network. There isn't that system behind you to help protect you in those situations. And that's what the traditional media in some senses can still provide. And that's what allows me the freedom to go off and think I need to pursue this story because I know ultimately I've got the backing of my editor and my institution to do so. And that is what allows us to be more courageous and more brave than the average person. And I think it's important to put a lot of value on this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
With the caveat of everything else I've said about how brilliant social media is in many ways as well.
Yeah. No, you again are spot on with that, and I like to call the work that you do and others do positive disruption, right? So you're a positive disruptor. And I think that's really important to hold on to, because you do need people who hold the mirror up, who do share the truth, who do let people know what is actually happening behind all the kind of clickbait headlines that you might see. And that positive disruption, as you said, takes an element of bravery and boldness and putting yourself out there. In order for us to do that, you do need a community and support around you. So you've got your editors and your community there. And it takes us quite nicely into the reason why the Asian Comms Network was set up. It was set up because there are people out there who don't have a safe network that they can lean on, or they don't have the opportunity to ask questions that will allow them to be bold and be brave and feel lonely and isolated. It can be lonely and isolated in the work that we do, not only in the sense of often being solo, doing the solo kind of work, not have a huge team, or even being one of very few faces that look like you in that space, and whether you're asking the right questions. So when we set up the Asian Comms Network, as you know, last year, it was all about how do we bring this community together so they feel heard, they don't feel that they, are alone, and they can build connection and celebrate and collaborate with others like them doing similar roles, or at least learning from people who are doing different roles, right? That's the whole point. So tonight, today is our first year anniversary celebration meal. It's been a whole year of the ACN, and we're bringing together journalists, marketeers, communication, PR folks together with allies to celebrate what we have achieved over the last 12 months. And it's because of people like you, Mehreen, who have supported from an advisory point of view, who've given us that support and accolade almost, and validation to say that this is good and it is needed in the community. So I suppose as we wrap up this conversation, my words to anyone who's watching either now or on replay is, you don't have to do any of this alone. The world may seem a little bit scary. It may seem that it's out of your control. It may seem that you don't have the power to make change happen, but you do have the power within your own remit to do the things that Mehreen shared, like finding your platform, sharing your story, being mindful, building communities and connection, and being optimistic in the way that you can be. So if you are looking for that kind of support, then please do get in touch with us at hello@asiancommsnetwork.com. We will, answer any questions that you have. And if you've got any questions for Mehreen, once you're reflecting on this conversation, then do pop them in the comments, and we'll make sure that we send them on to Mehreen to answer as well. And I'm sure that you'll be, I hope, I've just kind of put you in that spot there, Mehreen, but hopefully you'll be okay to answer.
Of course, I'd be more than happy to help.
Brilliant. If people wanted to connect with you, what's the best platform for them to do that with you?
Email is usually my preferred platform, just because that's usually all my workflow go through my email. It's name.surname@times.co.uk. It's not too difficult to find. So yeah, I'd be happy to hear from anyone, and send me a good pitch about economics.
Yes, definitely. I suppose actually let's end on that. Actually, if people, if any public relations folks and comms folks are listening and they're pitching to journalists, what is the one tip you would give them to get their story noticed?
Direct it at the right person. I write about economics. Very, very few people would understand what economics is or what I write about. It's not housing policy. It's not something to do with various companies, various sectors. It's the economy. It's a very amorphous, often concept, but understand who the journalist is and what they do before you send them the email, because basically 90% of pitches I get just don't even cover the sides of what I do as a beat.
Fab advice. So do your research, find the right person, make sure you're pitching the right story to the right journalist. Otherwise, it will be ignored and discarded. So great advice. Thank you so much, Mehreen, for your time, your energy, and your honesty throughout about this conversation. And if, like I said, if anybody's got any questions about the ACN or work questions related to the stuff that Mehreen does, then please do stay in touch. We will be back next week, next Wednesday at 12 o'clock with another guest. So please do stay tuned in. But for now, I'll say goodbye and thank you so much, Mehreen, for your time.
Thanks for having me.